Hi friends, and welcome back to another episode of Crime and Curiosities. This is episode number 2. First of all, thank you so much for everyone who tuned in to my first episode. Really appreciate everyone's feedback, and I'm really grateful that everyone's enjoying the show and is so excited for episode 2. So, some of the major feedback I received after the first episode was to make things a little less scripted. So, I just have an outline for this episode. I don't have a script, so there will definitely be some parts where I fumble, some parts where I go back. You're going to hear me say a lot. We're going to give this a try though, and let me know what you think about this format as opposed to me directly reading from a completed script. And for sure, leave me case suggestions and stuff on the Facebook page. I have a whole list of things that I eventually want to cover in the podcast, but I don't really know what order everyone wants to see things in. I don't know if there's things that you'd rather see first. And of course, there's always going to be cases that I have never heard of or that I don't know much about that other people might suggest, and I'll be able to research and maybe, find something that will be news to all of us. I do, like I said, really appreciate all the feedback from the first episode. I heard a lot of people say that they had never heard of Kimberly's case, which is not really super surprising to me. I knew it was kind of an out there one. Well, not really out there, but it was, when it first happened, it was obviously a big deal, but it's been 30 years, so I thought it would be nice, first of all, to do something that was kind of closer to home for me, and also something a little older, and something that people may not know about. So those of you who know me personally know that this kind of stuff, true crime, anything like that, is a huge passion of mine, something that I love to talk about. I talk about it at work, I talk about it in everyday conversation, I talk about it with my mom, I talk about it with my friends, I talk about it to my cat. It's crazy how much I love this stuff. So today we're gonna talk about my absolute favorite serial killer. I know that sounds a little strange to say that I have a favorite serial killer, but let me explain myself a little bit. I don't mean that I think he's attractive or that I think he's cool or that, this isn't a Ted Bundy type situation where I'd be waiting outside the courthouse if I could and holding up signs and saying how handsome he is. No. It's not like that. I am fascinated by all things psychology, and when I say that this episode is about my favorite serial killer, I mean I find what he did and how he did it fascinating. Obviously, as we get into this episode, you'll see that his crimes were pretty heinous, pretty horrific, and they were, that's for sure. But I guess what I mean is when I look into his background and what led up to these events and what he said after the events and all of that kind of compiled together makes this my favorite serial killer, and I thought a really good subject for episode 2. So I hope that you guys like this one. Again, leave me any feedback and let's get into it. The Green River Killer is considered the most prolific serial killer by confessed murders in the United States. He has confessed to at least 71 murders and was charged in the end with 49, which, as I said, makes him the most prolific by confirmed body count serial killer in the history of the United States. I first heard about the Green River Killer by actually watching an episode of Criminal Minds. I love Criminal Minds. I don't really watch it anymore, and I think it's done now, but I love that show. Obviously, anyone who's fascinated with true crime would find that fascinating. And they often mentioned the Green River Killer because, of course, being the most prolific serial killer in US history, they would talk about him quite a bit, just kind of name drop him a little bit. I don't think they ever did an episode like loosely based off of his case or anything, because I know that with some other cases they kind of had, like the Robert Pickton case, they had done a episode based off of that sort of thing. I don't think they ever did one with the Green River Killer, but he was frequently mentioned. So I remember just like Googling it once and falling down this rabbit hole of the Green River Killer, and it just blew my mind, because the first thing you realize when you Google him is how normal he looks. And I feel like you hear that all the time. Like, oh, he was such a normal man, you know. I always use Ted Bundy as a reference just because of the movie and everything that's come out recently. It's something people know about. You know, oh, he was so handsome and he was so kind. When you see the Green River Killer, I put a picture of him on the Facebook page. When you see the Green River Killer, you're like, this looks like any guy down the street. You might see him at the grocery store or whatever. But what even adds to that is when you find out just the absolute horrificness of what he's done. I don't know if horrificness is a word. I might have just made that up. Anyways, it's absolutely horrifying. I'll start from the beginning. So I'll tell you first a little bit about the Green River Killer. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, but they moved from Salt Lake City. His parents were named Mary and Thomas Ridgway. They moved from Salt Lake City when Gary was 11, and he was raised in a poor neighborhood near the Seattle Pacific Highway. Keep that name in mind because that's going to come up a lot. Gary had a bit of a messed up childhood, which is pretty common, I guess, with killers, especially serial killers, obviously. Gary had a very domineering mother. I know from taking psychology in school that your relationship with your mother, especially a young boy's relationship with his mother, is very important, especially in the formative years. Gary had a bit of a messed up one with his mom. She was known to kind of be domineering over his father, kind of, you know, she wore the pants in the family, that's for sure. And she did this really weird thing to Gary. Gary had a bedwetting problem until he was 13. And every time he had an accident, he wet the bed, his mother would take him into the bath. So imagine this, like a 13-year-old boy. Those are, you know, your formative years there, especially sexuality-wise. And she would take him into the bath nude. She would be wearing often just like a bathrobe. And she would wash his genitals, you know, clean him up as if he was a baby, but he was, you know, a preteen. Gary has said that led to some confusing feelings for him because he was angry with his mother. You know, she was very controlling in the household, etc. But he was also sexually attracted to her, and this was something, you know, very confusing for a young boy. That blows my mind. His father, Gary's father, Thomas, was a bus driver in the area that Gary grew up, and he often drove along the Seattle Pacific Highway. In that area, there were a lot of prostitutes, a lot of, you know, women soliciting sex. The area was also pretty common for runaways. Gary's father would sometimes take Gary on the bus with him, and one thing Gary really clearly remembers is his father complaining about the presence of sex workers, and this is something that you will see very soon really affected Gary throughout his whole life, is this idea that his father put in his head about, you know, sex workers. So Gary, he had kind of a low IQ. He was held back in school. He was dyslexic. A lot of people in his life described him as friendly but strange, which I guess, you know, makes a lot of sense. Especially when you hear what Gary was up to throughout his life. One really interesting thing of note that I didn't know about until I started kind of like re-researching for the podcast was that when Gary was 16, he led a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him through his ribs into his liver. The boy survived, thank goodness. They both say, the boy and Gary, that as Ridgway walked away, he laughed and said he had always wondered what it felt like to kill someone. Gary did eventually graduate 2 years late in 1969. So he was 20 when he graduated high school, and he married his high school girlfriend. She was 19 at the time. Shortly after this, Gary joined the Navy and he was sent to Vietnam. He worked on a combat ship and he did see battle. While Gary was in Vietnam, though, he wasn't exactly the most faithful husband. And first you want to be like, oh, Gary, what were you thinking? But his wife was also cheating on him while he was away, and he was cheating on her with prostitutes. Even though he eventually contracted gonorrhea from sex workers in Vietnam, he said that that didn't stop him from having unprotected sex with the workers. It made him angry, but it didn't stop him. So obviously, when Gary returned from Vietnam, he found out that his wife had also been cheating on him. I guess that was a bigger deal to him than him cheating on his wife and getting gonorrhea from a sex worker in Vietnam, and so the marriage ended within a year. Gary's first 2 marriages ended due to infidelities, and his second wife, Marcia, says that Gary became religious during his second marriage, and she was forced to follow the strict teachings of the religion that Gary followed. He gave out Bibles door to door. I believe it's called proprietarizing Bibles door to door. It was a big word and I didn't want to mess it up, so I just said he was handing them out. He read the Bible at work, he read the Bible at home, and he was known to cry during sermons at church. He was a very active member of the church and a very faithful, God-driven man, and he was also forcing his wife to have sex multiple times a day, sometimes in public places, and sometimes in places where they would later find the bodies of his victims. Gary's sexual appetite was said to be insatiable. Like I said, he would ask his wife or girlfriends to have sex multiple times a day. He had a fascination with having sex in public places, and he also had a fascination with sex workers. As I mentioned before, Gary's father would often take him on his bus route with him, and that's kind of where Gary was first exposed to prostitution. He would see, sex workers soliciting along the street and hear his father complain about their presence. So Gary did the same. He would often complain about the presence of the sex workers in the area, but was also using their services, and at the same time was considered to be this very religious man, very faith-driven, very strict with his wife, but also had this lust and this moral dilemma of, sexual desire and insatiability, and just in general a bit of a hard time for Gary, I would think. We see this a lot, I think, kind of like religion versus these desires and needs. There's a few cases I can think of. Actually, I listened to a podcast the other day about the John List case, and while this isn't sexually involved, this man killed his family because he believed that they were getting off track, and if he killed them, they had a better chance of getting into heaven than if he had let them continue to sin. So he killed them basically before it could get any worse. Another really fascinating case, but there's not a lot of information on it, so I don't think I would be able to do a whole podcast on it, but it's an interesting one, and I might leave the link for that podcast on Facebook. So yeah, Gary, at this point, he was murdering. Most of his murders were committed between 1982 and 1984. Remember the Pacific Highway? That's where most of the victims were believed to be picked up. They were usually either sex workers or runaways, and he strangled them and dumped their bodies in and around the area of the Green River, the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and other dump sites within South King County. Gary wasn't originally suspected of this, and this is kind of the crazy thing to me, and the thing that always stuck out in this case is that he has a kill count as high as 71, and we know for sure that he killed at least 49 young women, and Gary was not caught until 2001. And the really frustrating part of all of this is that there were times when he could have been caught. But much like Ted Bundy, much like even, say, Jeffrey Dahmer, and many other serial killers or just killers that we see in general, he managed to fly under the radar, and it just blows my mind that 49 women were killed, and Gary can be attributed to that, but he wasn't caught until nearly 20 years after he began the murders. So a little bit of detail about the murders. The first 5 victims were found along the Green River, so that's how he ended up with the name the Green River Killer, because obviously at the time police didn't know who he was. He didn't have an actual name, so the media began to dub him as the Green River Killer, and that kind of stuck. One of the, I guess, most horrifying things about all of this to me, not that the whole thing isn't horrifying, but he was taking these women. Like I said, these women were often runaways or sex workers, and he would pick them up along the Pacific Highway South. Strangulation was his preferred method of murder. Most of the time he strangled them with his bare hands, but eventually he started to use a ligature, so like rope or something, because he was finding that he was ending up with scars and scratches on his arms from the women fighting back, and he didn't want to be caught for that, so he started using ligatures rather than his bare hands. And another thing that I find absolutely disgusting is that he would often go back to his victims, his deceased victims, and have sex with their dead bodies. And Gary explained that he didn't find necrophilia more sexually satisfying than sex with a live person, but it was just easier because he didn't have to worry about finding a live victim and being caught. So that is just like absolutely mind-blowing to me and horrific. He did say later on that he started to bury the victims to try to help him resist the temptation of going back to have sex with their dead bodies. And eventually they found DNA in the bodies. And at the time they couldn't test it, but technology advanced, Gary, and you got caught. Another thing that he would do, which smart but crazy, is he would occasionally contaminate the dump sites where he had left these young women with cigarette butts, gum, other things to try and throw the police off. And he even drove some of the remains across state lines into Oregon to try and confuse the police and make them think that the killer kind of had a wider range than he really did. In the early 1980s, after some of these murders started to occur, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force to investigate the murders, and the task force eventually even periodically interviewed the incarcerated Ted Bundy in 1984. Bundy offered his opinions on the motivations and the behavior of the Green River Killer. Honestly, I think he was probably just doing it for attention, but at the same time, I mean, I guess if anyone knew about murdering people, it was Ted Bundy. So he had actually said to the police, hey, I think that this guy is going back to the bodies after he kills them. And he told the police that if they found a fresh body, that they should stake it out because they might see the man go back. As we know, Gary was going back to the bodies after the murder. Ted was right there, I suppose. Another interesting thing, this whole thing is interesting, obviously. Gary was arrested in 1982 and in 2001 on charges related to prostitution. I believe one of them was soliciting. And he had become a suspect in the Green River killings in 1983. But in 1984, Gary passed a polygraph test. So they didn't look into him any further. I believe at one point his truck had been spotted, tracked it down to his home, opened the door, like, hello, Mr. Ridgway, and he was let off. Back in the 80s, obviously DNA wasn't as advanced as it is, and polygraph tests were considered to be the end-all be-all, and Gary passed a polygraph test. So how on earth could he have been the killer? We know now that polygraph tests are often inaccurate because they're based on your level of stress, not your level of guilt. And Gary was not stressed about these murders. He was calm and he was able to fool this lie detector test because to him, what he was doing was no big deal. In Gary's second marriage, he did have a son. That's another thing that's just absolutely horrifying to me. But apparently he was a decent father and he did get to see his son even after the marriage broke down, and he can be heard an interview tape, which I believe you can find on YouTube, saying that he kept a picture of his son in his wallet purposely because often the sex workers would ask to see his ID, just as a form of safety for them. And, if something did go wrong, they would know this man's name. And what Gary would do would be open his wallet, and beside his ID was a picture of his son, and he would use his thumb to cover his name on the ID, but he would very prominently show off a picture of his little boy so that these women had a false sense of security about who Gary was as a person. Oh, he's a father, he's not going to hurt me. Sometimes he would keep toys in the car so that they, thought he had children, maybe more than just the one son, and it gave them a false sense of trust. And on at least one occasion, Gary admits to, his son was present for a murder. He was in the truck with Gary when Gary picked up a victim, and that's just absolutely horrifying to me, because even at the time, if he didn't know what was going on, he knows now what happened. And to know that you were in the vehicle when your dad picked up someone that he would later strangle and commit a sex act on after she had already passed, that's just, I can't even imagine. I'm not even going to pretend to imagine what that was like. In 1985, Gary began dating a woman named Judith Mawson, and in 1988 they actually got married. And an interesting thing to note, carpet, obviously, this sounds so weird to talk about, but carpet was a big deal back then. It was like a luxury item. And Judith noticed when she moved into Gary's house that he didn't have any carpet. And now they wonder, did he wrap somebody's body up in the carpet that had been in his home and take it out? But obviously at the time, Judith didn't think anything of it. He also would leave early for work, or that's what he would tell Judith, on kind of like the pretense of that he was going in for overtime pay, but we now believe he may have been committing murders. He would also say he was going to stop by the junkyard on the way home, but he would get home and have, nothing really with him that he would have got at the junkyard. Judith does believe that Gary committed some of the murders that are attributed to him while they were together, but Gary himself has admitted that his kill rate went down while he was in a relationship with Judith because he says he truly did love her. And of his 49 known victims, only 3 were killed after he married Mawson, which is also scary to think about. That before that, from 1982 to 1984, he killed the majority of the women that he's attributed to killing. That's just crazy to me, that in a 2-year period, he had taken the lives of so many people. He was committing these murders in 82, 83, 84, and even a few after that we know of, but it is believed that he could have kept going after that, but the majority of those murders were from 1982 to 1984. The case doesn't end there. Obviously, we know, because we know Gary's name, that he is the Green River Killer. So obviously you know that he was caught. This is also kind of a mind-blowing story to me, just how 20 years later he was caught for these crimes. First of all, the fact that it took 20 years is just crazy to me, but I also know that technology, even in 2001 when Gary was arrested, isn't as good as it is today. And in 1982, technology definitely wasn't where it is today, or where it was in 2001. In 1987, police had actually collected DNA samples from Gary, but they couldn't do anything with them at the time. DNA wasn't advanced, so they couldn't compare them to the samples that had been found in the victims. In 2001, those samples were analyzed, and Gary Ridgway was a match. And on November 30th of 2001, Gary was at the Kentworth Truck Factory, where he worked as a spray painter, and where he had worked as a spray painter for 20 years, for his entire life, and while he was committing these murders. So he was arrested on the suspicion of murdering 4 women nearly 20 years earlier, after being identified as a potential suspect in the late 80s. The DNA evidence conclusively linked him. Obviously, the evidence they collected was semen semen from these women, and it was matched to a saliva swab that had been taken by the police in 87. The first 4 victims named in the original indictment were Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen, but then 3 more victims, Wendy Cofield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes, were added to the indictment after forensic science identified microscopic bits of spray paint as a specific brand and type of paint that was used at the Kentworth factory during the specific time frame that the victims were killed. And obviously Gary had worked there for so long that they were able to make the connection, and 3 more victims were added to the indictment. So there's kind of a bit of a stall here for about 2 years. Gary's in jail, but he hasn't confessed to anything. At first, he denied being involved in any of the murders, but obviously, with this many murders on the table, the death penalty was also on the table. And I think this is an interesting point of debate here, not the death penalty itself. That's a whole other ball game. What really sticks out here is that immediately the first thing you want to think is, oh my god, he eventually confessed to killing 71 women. The task force attributed him with killing 49 women. He is charged eventually for 49 murders. Why not the death penalty? But what actually happened was that Gary was given a plea bargain in return for confessing to the murders and for helping to lead the police to some bodies that they had been unable to recover. So basically, in exchange for his cooperation, the death penalty was taken off the table. Ridgway explained that he had killed all of his victims inside King County in Washington, and that he had transported and dumped the remains of the 2 women near the Portland River, as I mentioned before, to confuse the police. I'm gonna read a statement here just about the plea deal, because a lot of people obviously were angry that the death penalty was taken off the table. So the quote I'm going to read is actually from King County prosecuting attorney Norm Malang, and he is explaining his decision to make the deal, and I think he explains it really well. So he says, "We could have gone forward with 7 counts, but that is all we could have ever hoped to solve. At the end of that trial, whatever the outcome, there would have been lingering doubts about the rest of these crimes. This agreement was the avenue to truth, and in the end, the search for the truth is still why we have a criminal justice system. Gary Ridgway does not deserve our mercy. He does not deserve to live. The mercy provided by today's resolution is directed not at Ridgway, but towards the families who have suffered so much." So they went ahead with the plea deal, not because Gary deserved to live, not because he had killed all these women, but he was such a good guy or anything like that. Obviously, he's killed a lot of people, and they weren't being merciful towards Gary with this bargain. They were being merciful towards the families who may find some sort of peace and comfort and resolution with at least knowing what had happened to their daughter or sister or mother or wife or whatever the situation may be. On December 18th, 2003, Gary was sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole and 1 consecutive life sentence, so 49 in total. And he was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims. So that added 480 years to his 48 life sentences. So obviously he's never getting out of prison. He led prosecutors to 3 bodies in 2003, and you can actually find some YouTube videos of this, which is crazy. He's just like sitting in the back of a truck in a white prison uniform and calmly explaining where the bodies might be. And the other crazy thing to me is that Gary doesn't remember some of these murders. He even says that he doesn't remember his first murder, which I would think would be an impactful thing, and maybe he blocked them out or whatever, but I think that just this was his thing. He was so focused on killing these women. He doesn't remember their names. He didn't remember where some of them were. In August of the same year, so of 2003, they had found some more remains that were believed to belong to a victim of the Green River Killer. More remains were found in September of 2003, and in November of 2005, a weekend hiker found the skull of one of the 48 women that Ridgway had admitted to murdering. Yeah, they did eventually find some bodies, or at least have the ability to say to families, yes, he says he did this. Gary said that he did his best to remember as much as he could to help the prosecution and to help the families. And he does cry in court a few times, especially when one of the victims' fathers says that he's a good Christian man and that he should forgive Gary, and Gary does cry in court over that. In February of 2004, county prosecutors began to release videotapes of Gary's confessions, and in one interview in particular, he told the investigators that he was responsible for the death of at least 65 women, but in another interview in December of 2003, he claimed to have murdered 71 victims, and he confessed to having sex with them before killing them, not just after, which is a detail that he didn't reveal until after his sentencing, so I guess clever on his part, because he would have had some rape charges there too. Not that it would have mattered, he's going to be in prison forever anyways. An interesting note, as we've talked before, about how Gary ended up with this fascination with prostitutes and with killing them. In one of his confessions, he says that he did indeed target prostitutes, and he says he did so because they were easy to pick up and that he hated most of them. He confessed that he had sex with the victims' bodies after he murdered them, but he claimed that he began burying later victims so that he could resist the urge to commit necrophilia. And as if all of that is not disgusting enough, Gary later said in a statement that murdering young women was his career. So that's the story of the Green River Killer. I just think from a true crime standpoint, to a psychological standpoint, to just a curiosity standpoint, it's just a mind-blowing case. How someone get away with murder for that long, 49 victims, and get away with it for almost 20 years, I just think that's, first of all, absolutely crazy. And then you have this, faith versus carnal need kind of situation, which I also just think is crazy to think about. This man was handing out Bibles door to door, but then killing prostitutes and engaging in sexual intercourse with their bodies. It's just a whole just mind-blowing situation. Gary's still in prison. He's 71 now, I believe. Yeah, he's in solitary confinement at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. So yeah, obviously Gary is still in prison. He went through a few prison moves. He was moved from Washington State Penitentiary to a different prison, a high security federal prison in Colorado, but he was eventually moved back to Washington State Penitentiary so that he would be easily accessible for any of the open murder investigations. So yeah, he's still in Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, and I'm assuming that's where he'll be for the rest of his life unless they move him again, which I doubt that they will. And that's Gary Ridgway, still in prison, gonna be there forever, where he should be. And the only bit of mercy that came from this case, as we discussed before, is that he did at least admit to committing the crimes and was able to give some details, etc. Obviously that doesn't make him a martyr, it doesn't make him a great person. He still did what he did. I mean, at least he had the decency to tell these people where their family members were. So that's my favorite serial killer, which I hope you can kind of see why. It's just an interesting, mind-blowing case, and like I said, he is considered to be one of the most prolific serial killers in history, and he is the most prolific by confessed body count in the United States. So that's episode 2. Thank you for tuning in. This one's a little bit longer than the last one, so I hope that you enjoy that. Should be around 40 minutes or so, which I'm really excited about. That's kind of the length I've been aiming for. Let me know what you think of the format. Let me know if you kind of like this, me just going off talking thing instead of being so scripted, or if you'd rather I had a bit more of a plan. This is only episode 2, so we're still learning. I'm still learning how to edit, still learning how to use my mic, still buying audio supplies. Also, a huge shout out to everyone who said that they really enjoyed the intro, the music. Once again, that's my friend Jared, and I'll link him in the info, and I'll put his link on the Facebook page and everything. Speaking of social media, of Facebook, you can find us on Facebook at Crime and Curiosities. You can also find me on Instagram by searching the same thing, and you can find me on Twitter at Crime Curious Pod, and I also uploading the episodes to YouTube. So once again, if you search Crime and Curiosities, you should be able to find that. And that's about it for today. So thank you for listening, and leave me suggestions for other cases, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye, friends!